Advisory Board, Dr. Benjamin Bikman.
Woo! Woo!
Thank you. Good afternoon. It is wonderful to be back here with you. Thank you so much for coming. I am honored to be your guest professor for the next hour. And thank you for being my honorary students. It makes a professor very happy to have students to teach. But I want you to be good students and to take lots of notes so that you can go and become a teacher to someone else, okay? So be good students. What I am here to speak with you about today is the metabolic storm. You have heard Mr. Hughes talk about this already. This problem of poor metabolic health that is going over the entire world. In order to solve the problem, you must understand it. So let's talk about it. Worldwide, there is an epidemic of poor metabolic health. Over half of all adults around the world, over half of everyone you know, has some form of insulin resistance. It is the most common health disorder worldwide. Now, insulin resistance is a big problem, not only because of how common it is, but also because of what it causes, where insulin resistance can become diabetes, which you've heard about already. Insulin resistance can become heart disease. It can become problems of fertility, where if a man and woman are having trouble having a baby, sometimes it is a metabolic problem. But also problems of the mind, problems that scare us, like Alzheimer's disease, migraine headaches, and even depression have a metabolic or insulin resistance foundation. So when you're talking to your friends and you mention insulin resistance, you mention that insulin resistance plays into all of these chronic diseases. Now, your friend may ask you, what is insulin? I want you to have an answer for them. So insulin is a hormone that comes from the pancreas. Within the pancreas, which is right beneath the stomach, there are these cells called beta cells. And beta cells wait for a signal. And when blood glucose levels start to go up, then the beta cells will say, oh, I know what to do, and they will release insulin. And when they release insulin, insulin goes through the body and knocks on the doors of cells like muscle cells or fat cells. And it will tell those cells to pull in the glucose. And now the blood glucose can come down. Now this is insulin's most famous effect, but insulin actually does all kinds of things. It tells all kinds of cells to grow. It tells fat tissue to grow. It regulates our electrolytes in our bodies. Insulin does all kinds of things. Its most famous thing is that it will push down glucose. So glucose and insulin have a very, very close relationship. And when glucose is going up, then insulin will go up. I want you to understand why this is important. If you're talking to your friends and you're telling them about how glucose is affecting insulin resistance and insulin, why does this matter? Well, let's put the glucose away for just a moment, but we're going to come back to glucose in just a few moments, and let's just talk about insulin. Insulin, when it is elevated, plays into insulin resistance. There is no such thing as insulin resistance and all of the problems that it causes if there isn't also elevated insulin. These two things always come together. Now, as I have given some talks for unicity, which I always love, I have been interested to see how you are interested in the connection between insulin resistance and depression. This is a very, very delicate topic, but it is very important for you to know that there is a lot of scientific evidence suggesting that in some instances, depression has a connection which is insulin resistance. And I wanted to just take a moment and make sure you were aware of how that happens. So that if you mention this to your friends, that your friend will say, well, how is depression connected to insulin resistance? Now you can answer them. So the brain, you can see my brain very well because I have nothing covering it. The brain has a very high metabolic rate. It is very hungry. Hopefully your brains are very hungry right now because you're listening and learning so much. But the brain always wants to pull in energy. And one of those energy sources is glucose. So glucose is fueling the brain. The brain is like an engine and it just keeps running. It needs lots of fuel. Insulin opens the door to allow the glucose to come in. And so when the brain is getting very hungry and it wants glucose among its fuels, it needs insulin to help the glucose come in. But what happens when insulin isn't working very well? What happens when the brain becomes insulin resistant? Now the brain can't get enough of its energy from the glucose. So the glucose coming in to fuel the brain isn't working very well. The brain starts to go very hungry. Its energy use starts to go down. And in some people, that manifests or that causes depression. In other people, it may cause migraine headaches. In other people, it may cause a forgetful mind or something like early stage Alzheimer's disease. These seem like different diseases, but they have one thing in common. The brain is going hungry because insulin isn't working well. In other words, the brain has become insulin resistant. Now, if you've been telling this to your friend may say, well, where does insulin resistance come from? You need to know where it comes from in order to explain this to them. The most common cause of insulin resistance is too much insulin. It's almost like when we are hearing a loud sound for so long, we start to become deaf to that sound. We don't hear it as well anymore. When the body has been so loaded with insulin for so long, the body stops listening. It becomes like a naughty little child. And I know a lot about that because I have 3 of them at home. So too much insulin causes insulin resistance. As one goes up, so too does the other. Now, if too much insulin causes insulin resistance, now your friend may say, well, where does all of that insulin come from? Why does my body have so much insulin? And this brings us back to glucose. Let's look at what happens when a person eats fat or protein or carbohydrate. Those are the 3 macronutrients. And in English, that word macro means big. They're the big parts of the diet. So you teach your friend about the macronutrients, fats, proteins, and carbohydrate. And then you tell them when a person eats fat, there will be no insulin response. When a person eats protein, there may be a small response, but it's generally quite modest. But when a person eats pure carbohydrate, then all of a sudden insulin goes up by 10 times, and even at its fastest, it'll take 3 hours before it comes back down to normal. So that matters. It matters even more because when you look globally at the amount of what people eat, over 70% of all calories worldwide come from carbohydrates. And usually this is refined carbohydrates, so sugars and refined starches. So not only are we eating most carbohydrate, but that also happens to be the one thing that keeps insulin the highest. Now, I'm not done talking about carbohydrates because they can become a problem. In our bodies, when we eat glucose, at any moment, we have only about 1 teaspoon, just 4 grams of glucose in our entire body. That is in our blood. We only have 4 grams of glucose in our blood. That is very, very little. But then what happens if we go eat a chocolate bar? We go eat some candy. A normal chocolate bar has 10 times more glucose in it than in my entire blood. If I take all of that glucose into my body, that will increase my blood glucose so much that if it stays high, I would die. Just from the sugar in one chocolate bar, one candy bar, it will increase the glucose levels so much that it would make a person die. And so we cannot keep the blood glucose levels so high. And we have someone who can come and help. If blood glucose is going up, remember there's a hormone that can come from the pancreas to help the blood glucose come down. Do you remember the name of the hormone?
Insulin.
Yes, it's insulin. So insulin now is a hero. It's a savior. In this role, insulin is saving our lives by not letting our blood sugar, our blood glucose be too high for too long. So the glucose starts to come up, insulin will come up, and it will act to push the glucose down. Remember, because it opens doors and allows the glucose to come out of the blood. And so it saves us. However, this can happen too often, too much. So you'll remember, most people, the average global diet is over 70% carbohydrates. And so when you keep eating and your glucose goes up and the insulin's coming up, then insulin resistance starts to follow. So a person eats glucose, insulin goes up. They eat more glucose, insulin goes up even higher. They need more and more insulin, and they get more and more insulin resistant. Okay, so far I have been talking a lot about insulin and insulin resistance. I worry that you might be getting a little tired of insulin. So for the first time ever, in any unicity talk I've ever given, aren't you so lucky? For the first time ever, I want to talk about some of the specific effects of glucose. What I've been talking about so far is that glucose only matters because it pushes up insulin. But that's not entirely true. Not that I've been tricking you. That's all true and very important. But it's also important for you to understand another effect of too much glucose. Because yes, too much glucose causes too much insulin, which causes insulin resistance, but also glucose has this ability to be kind of sticky. When glucose is too high, it will start binding. It will stick to various molecules in the body, including proteins. And when glucose gets stuck to something like a protein, it starts to damage whatever it is stuck to. It messes up the shape. And now this thing, in this case, the protein was going to go through my blood and do something important. When glucose comes and binds on it and sticks onto it, now it can't. So when glucose binds, this is a process that is called glycation. This is a new word for some of you, but it's something I want you to remember so that when you go talk to your friends about the metabolic storm, I want you to be able to talk about insulin resistance. Now I also want you to talk about the problems of glycation. And glycation happens not only at proteins, it also can happen at fats, it can happen at DNA. Within the nucleus, I'm sorry translators, within the nucleus of the cells, the glycation can damage DNA and cause mutations. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Professor Bikman is being a little dramatic. Let me just help you understand how relevant this is. And never forget insulin resistance, but now we've added to the story. Because when the cells of the brain start to get too much glucose and they get glycated, they suffer. The heart can suffer. The kidneys can suffer. Even our bones can suffer. But when the brain experiences too much glycation, brain problems happen, including Alzheimer's disease. So there is substantial evidence to show that Alzheimer's disease is partly a consequence of too much glucose. And the glucose is getting stuck, it's getting sticky, and it is damaging the brain's ability to function. Now, what about the heart? When the heart muscle starts to get too much glucose binding to it, it directly damages the muscle, causing heart disease. In fact, the problem goes even further when it comes to the heart, because the blood vessels, if we look at the blood vessels in a person, the blood vessels start to have some glycation as well. And then the blood vessels get damaged. And then you start to have things like atherosclerosis and other problems. So more heart disease. Now what about the kidneys? The kidneys actually, as from a metabolic scientist, it's interesting to note that they actually have the highest metabolic rate of any part of the body. But when there's too much glucose coming to the kidneys, they get damaged. And now the person has kidney disease. And even the bones. When the bones and all their proteins start to have glycation, now the person starts to have osteoarthritis, where the bones start to get weaker and more and more fragile. This fly wants to learn about insulin resistance. Pesky fly. It's a good student. He just wants to learn. I can't blame him. Okay, now, you look at these tissues, the brain, you look at the heart, the bones, and it's easy for us to think, well, that's okay, because I can't see those. What we can see is the skin. Now, I know many of you are very interested in looking good. I don't care as much as I used to. When you're a freckled old man, it's okay to not look good. But some people want to look good. Yeah, I do too. I want to look good. But even on the skin, with all of the proteins and the collagen of the skin, there's evidence to show that when the skin has too much glycation, it starts to cause the wrinkles on the skin. So this could make someone start to look much older. So as the glucose levels are higher and higher, it starts to make more and more glycation, and then the person starts to get more wrinkled and begin to look older than they are. None of us want that. We want to look young. And so we want to control our glucose to control our glycation. So we have all of these tissues, the skin, the brain, the heart, and many, many more. All of them start to suffer when glycation starts to go up. But there's one other cell, and it's actually the most famous of all of them, that experiences some glycation, and that is the red blood cell. So the reason our blood is red is because of the red blood cells. And within the red blood cells, there is this complex structure, these proteins that we call hemoglobin. And hemoglobin, its most famous job is to carry oxygen. So when I am taking a breath, I'm pulling in the oxygen. How do I get that oxygen to my muscles, to my heart? It's because the blood cells will take that oxygen and bind it. And it will carry the oxygen down to wherever I need it, down to my muscles, everywhere it needs to go. However, when the hemoglobin has had glycation, now it doesn't fit the oxygen very well. So now our red blood cells, whose most important job is to carry oxygen, they can't carry the oxygen as well as they used to. That is a big problem. This is something that is called hemoglobin A1C, or HbA1c. That is a percent or a number that reflects how much glycation do I have on my red blood cells. And that is a number that we can use to say, how much glycation do I have in my entire body? You cannot measure the glycation in your brain. You cannot measure the glycation in your heart, but you can measure the glycation in your red blood cells. Have some of you ever had your HbA1c measured? I bet you have. It's a very common measurement, and it's a good measurement of glycation. Now, I want you to pay attention to this, because here I have the blessing, I'm such a lucky professor, to speak to students from around the world. And so I wanted to understand, how do people around the world have different levels of HbA1c, or hemoglobin glycation? Now, before I mention that, I want to mention the numbers. So usually, HbA1c is presented as a percent. How much of my red blood cells, what percent of my red blood cells has undergone glycation? And if you can see these cutoffs, a good range is considered anything from 4% up to the mid 5%. And then we go up higher to the mid 6s. and that is usually considered the cutoff. If someone has an HbA1c that is of 6.5% or higher, then we say they have type 2 diabetes. They have diabetes. We want it to be lower than that. Now, this has me come back to my point from a moment ago. We have so many people from so many beautiful countries. How are different people affected by HbA1c? So I was able to find multiple studies that compared these distinct populations: Europeans, Latinos, Asians, African, and then Arabic populations. All compared to European populations, all the same. Imagine if we had these 5 people and they were all the same body size, same height, same weight. If we control for all of those variables, if you compare the European to the average Latino will have about 0.1% higher. Now, what if we then go on to the average Asian? This is, in these studies, both East Asian and Southeast Asian. Then it's almost a quarter point higher on average. And that's about the same in African populations as well. And then the highest Arabic populations, a full 0.5% higher. Even when it's the same body type. These aren't people who are any chubbier, they're the same body, and yet the percent goes higher and higher and higher. So this is a very big problem. In fact, a very big problem, particularly here in Asia and Southeast Asia, because some populations, it seems, that in a European population, they can have normal glucose, but they need more insulin to do it. In some Asian populations, they cannot make enough insulin. The beta cells cannot make enough insulin. And so the insulin actually stays too low. So in that person, it might not be so much a problem of insulin resistance, but a problem of very high glucose, because there's not enough insulin to help bring the glucose down. So that could be why there's more glycation in Asian populations. Now, one of the problems of glycation that brings us back to insulin resistance is that more glycation leads to more inflammation. And when inflammation goes up, now insulin resistance also happens. So once again, even with glycation, we come back to insulin resistance, but the glycation itself is a separate problem that I want you to know. As my students, as you go become teachers to someone else, you talk about these two problems. Now, so far, I hope you've been paying attention. I hope you are awake. Unlike my normal students at my university who want to sleep through all of my lectures. Yes, thank you for being a little more exciting than they are. But you may be still thinking, as you are listening to Professor Bikman, I'm talking about the metabolic problem, about glucose and insulin. You may be wondering, how can I talk about this? One reason I've been presenting the questions is because I want you to anticipate the questions your friends may have. But also, I want you, your homework, as your professor, I'm assigning you some homework. I want you to go, when you leave here, call your friend or your family. I want you to teach them what you've learned. You're going to teach them about the metabolic storm. Too much insulin causing insulin resistance. Too much glucose causing glycation. These twin problems coming together and creating a storm. And then your friend is going to be a little scared. And they're going to say, well, what can I do to feel great? How can I stop these problems? And then you say, I have something that can help you. Now we get into the good news. As much as I've been lecturing you for several minutes, you may be thinking, boy, this is very depressing. I feel depression now. But here's the happy part, because this is a scary story. The metabolic problem is very scary, but it has a very happy ending. Okay, so too much insulin is contributing to insulin resistance. Too much glucose is contributing to glycation. Too much insulin and too much glucose are what's causing the problem. And so the solution is very simple. We just have to turn them around and bring them down. So you tell your friend, too much insulin, too much glucose. Your friend asks, what can I do? We need to bring them down. and you say there are two very easy ways, from a metabolic scientist, two easy ways to do this. Balance blood glucose, of some effective tools, and then second, helping your friend learn how to fast more frequently. Now let's talk about the first one, balancing blood glucose. One way you can help your friend learn to balance blood glucose is to focus on fiber. Because when a human eats glucose, I already showed you what happens to insulin. Insulin goes up very, very high and takes a long time to come down. However, if that glucose is matched with fiber, now all of a sudden you took that very, very high curve and you pushed it down. They still ate the same food, but by just matching that food with some glucose, with some good fiber, then they can bring the blood glucose down. Now your friend may say, well, that sounds wonderful, but I don't know how to get good fiber because not all fiber is the same. Not at all. There are lots of different types of fibers. So your friend may say, well, how can I get a good fiber? Do you have a good fiber that you can help them with?
Yes.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
You have a very good fiber to help them with. And you say, this has been formulated just for this, just to help bring your blood glucose under control. In fact, this will help balance your blood glucose. Now, they say, your friend will say, okay, wonderful, thank you. Is there anything else I can do? One more effect is chlorogenic acid. You can teach your friend that there is this molecule in some plants, and this is a quote from a scientific study. This molecule has been shown to not only help bring down fasting levels of insulin and glucose, but also when someone eats glucose, it pushes down that glucose level, just like fiber does. So chlorogenic acids are acting in a similar way. Now your friend may have never even heard of chlorogenic acid, and they will say, well, how can I find some chlorogenic acid? Do you have a source, do you think?
Yes.
Yes, you do. You have a tool that you can help your friend with, and you can say, I have this product that has been designed called Unimate to be enriched with chlorogenic acid. And one of its benefits, among many, is going to be to help your glucose and your insulin come under control, because we are trying to balance blood glucose. Now, this is the insulin curve, and now the purple line I'm showing you is what the glucose level is looking like. So when someone eats a lot of glucose, the insulin went up, but of course the glucose went up first. And at the top, when glucose goes up, it activates glycation. And we have all of those problems that we talked about before. So when we have an average individual who's eating a lot of carbohydrates all the time, their blood glucose levels are going crazy all day long. That is a term called glycemic variability. And this is high glycemic variability. Those levels of glucose go really high and then really low. The more a person has glucose levels that are going like that, the more risk they have of heart disease, of cancers, of Alzheimer's disease, depression, diabetes, and many more. So you are telling your friend, we cannot have glucose coming up and down all day long. We need to take these big spikes, and with a little bit of balance and a little Unimate, you can bring that under control. You can start to take the highs and the lows and start to press them down. Remember, this is not even changing the diet. You can balance blood glucose better by using these two tools to help your friend feel great. Okay, so that was all step one. That was the first part of this process. Balance blood glucose. Fiber in balance helps bring it down. The chlorogenic acid in Unimate also brings it down. They both work, and they work by two different mechanisms. So they work together very well. Now you tell your friend the benefit of fasting. Remember, globally, over 70% of all calories are coming from carbohydrates. That means that we have blood glucose levels that are going up all the time. In fact, if you're looking at the insulin levels of someone, most people start their day with a very high sugary breakfast. Then after they've had breakfast, because they've spiked their insulin, they get hungry, then they have a snack. Then they have a big carbohydrate heavy lunch. Then they have an afternoon snack. Then they have a big dinner. And then last of all, before they go to bed, they eat more sweets and more junk food, more carbohydrates. So they're spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. And too much insulin causes insulin resistance. So we need to help the friend wipe that off. Just get rid of all of these insulin and glucose spikes all day. And frequently fasting makes that better. And the easiest way to fast is just to take out one meal. Just help your friend learn to take out one meal in the day. And let's say it's breakfast, for example. Now, insulin is able to stay low all morning long, and it helps their body be more insulin sensitive. But your friend may say to you, as you are teaching them the benefits of fasting, they may say, but fasting is so hard. I don't want to fast. It's uncomfortable. How can we make it easier? But before we go to that, I want to just ask, why is fasting so difficult? I think if you can understand this, then you can help your friend learn to fast more easily. Well, from a metabolic scientist, I think there are two important things when it comes to why fasting gets so hard. One reason is cravings. The second reason is hunger. Those are not the same. Those are not the same thing. Cravings is when you have no reason to eat. You're not hungry at all, but you just want something. Hunger is when your tummy is rumbling and you just want to get something in your stomach. They're not the same. Let's talk about cravings first. And what do humans crave? What are the foods that if we are sitting down on a Saturday night and we're going to watch a TV show or a movie, what is it that we want to go eat? Remember, there are the three macronutrients: fats, proteins, and carbs. Humans have no addiction, no cravings to pure fat. No one is sitting down to watch a movie and they want to eat a stick of butter. It does not happen. So humans have no cravings for fat. Similarly, humans have no cravings for protein. I wish we did. Life would be so much easier. We would all be so much more metabolically healthy. But no one sits down on a Saturday night to turn on a movie and wants egg whites or just straight whey protein. No one. The one macronutrient that humans have a craving or even an addiction for is carbohydrates. There is an entire body of literature of published evidence showing that it's refined starches and especially sugar that we start to crave. That's what we want. When we sit down on a Saturday night and turn on a movie on the TV, it's something usually sweet and gooey, or it is salty and crunchy, and both of those are going to be based on carbohydrates. That's what we crave. Now, how can we help? If our mouths taste something that is bitter, it actually tricks our brain. And it tells our brain, hey, you don't crave that junk food actually. You don't need that junk food. So a bitter taste can turn down the sweet cravings. But how do we get the bitter taste? Where can some of these bitter tastes come from? If you know that bitter will help turn off the sweet cravings, how can we find something bitter? Well, there are two molecules that exist in nature that are known to be what's called bitter tastants. So when we taste them in our mouth, it activates these bitter taste receptors. They are molecules called theobromine and saponins. I bet you've heard of them before. And you're going to teach your friend about theobromine and saponins. And you're going to say, when your friend says, it's so hard for me to fast because I'm always craving candy or ice cream or something, you say, you need to put something bitter in your mouth. And there are these things called theobromine and saponin that can help. And then your friend will say, well, I don't know what those are. Where can I get them? You have an answer. You say, you can get them from Unimate. I already gave you some. And when you're craving something sweet, take some of this. Put it in your mouth. Mix a drink and drink it. And swish it around your mouth. And it can help tell your brain, I don't need that sweetness. So that's one way you can help your friend learn to fast more frequently, by helping them learn to control their cravings. Now, separate from cravings, as I said earlier, is hunger. Hunger is very, very tricky. It's very hard to understand hunger. One way to understand hunger is to look at what happens to blood glucose levels. When blood glucose levels go very, very high, that's a problem because we have glycation and we have lots of insulin. But the problem isn't over because when blood glucose goes very high very quickly, it usually comes down very quickly and often it will go too low. When blood glucose has gone up and now gone very low, that's called rebound hypoglycemia. Sorry, translators. So there's this low point of glucose after the blood glucose has gone very, very high. And when blood glucose dips too low, it makes the brain get very worried. The brain gets upset because it thinks the body is starting to run out of energy, and so it triggers our hunger. So one way to help control hunger is to never let our blood glucose levels go very high. So here is something you can remember, and you teach this to your friend. Avoid the highs to prevent the lows. And if you can prevent the low, you can prevent hunger. When someone eats a breakfast that spikes glucose very, very high, they shouldn't be hungry 2 hours later. They have plenty of energy, plenty of food. Why are they hungry? It's because their blood glucose went too high and now it went too low. So to prevent the lows, avoid the highs. Now, how can we do that? It's the same tools we talked about. For example, fiber. Fiber is a very, very good way to prevent the glucose from going up so high. And so you lower it down. Now the blood glucose levels won't go as high, and if they don't go as high, that means they will not drop as low. It will settle down more nicely, and it will help prevent hunger. Okay, now you tell your friend that balance can help prevent the highs to avoid the lows, and they can control hunger a little better. You're not done yet. Because then you tell your friends, but do you know what, friend? When you take balance, not only do you control your blood sugar and prevent it from going low, but the fiber, when it comes into the stomach, into the intestines, it starts to make the bacteria in our intestines start to make short chain fats. So the bacteria are eating the fiber, which is very good for the bacteria. It's a very good food for the bacteria. The bacteria are eating the fiber and then turning it into short chain fats. Now, the short chain fats get into the blood, they go to the brain, and they tell the brain, we don't need to eat. We have lots of energy. So it's another way for balance to help tell the brain that the body is okay, that we don't need to be hungry. Now, let's come back to the bitter tastants. You'll recall a moment ago I talked about the bitter tastants, theobromine and saponins, and how they can help reduce cravings. But now we're talking about hunger. Did you know that you also have bitter taste receptors in your intestines? That you drink some unomate and you taste the bitter in your mouth. But also, as it comes through your intestines can taste it as well. And when those bitter taste receptors are turned on in your intestines, it tells the brain, we don't need to eat. It reduces appetite. So this is one entirely new way to help your friend learn to control hunger. When they're learning how to fast, just a little bit, and the fasting gets a little uncomfortable, you now have these two tools to help them both control their cravings and control their hunger. And when they do this, then they can fast better. All right, now I'm not done talking about this hunger idea. One of the things that I love teaching the most at my university is a class all about hormones. Did you know that one of the most active hormone-producing tissues of the body is actually the intestines? It's not the thyroid, it's not the adrenal glands above the kidneys, it's the intestines. Our intestines are capable of producing dozens of hormones. About 50 or 60 hormones come from our guts. But the most famous I bet you've heard of it. It's called GLP-1. GLP-1 is a hormone that is released from the intestines. One of the reasons it's become so famous is because of what it does at our stomach and our brain. When GLP-1 comes to the stomach, it makes food stay in the stomach a little longer. And by making the food stay in the stomach a little longer, we're a little less hungry. We don't want to eat as much. At the same time, when GLP-1 goes to the brain, it tells the brain that we don't need to eat. It makes the brain tell the body that we're full, that we have better satiety. We're not hungry. We're not as hungry as much. So the collective effect, by going to the stomach and by going to the brain, is telling the body we don't need to eat. Hunger goes down. In fact, this works so well that now we have drugs that are designed to act like GLP-1. Have you heard of the drugs Ozempic and Wegovy?
Yes.
I bet you have. In fact, I bet you know people, I bet you have friends, maybe even some of you are taking these drugs because they work. A person will have almost no appetite. They never want to eat, and so naturally they lose weight. However, that form of weight loss has some negative consequences. Here was a study that was published just a couple years ago, and they found that with weight loss, with these drugs, up to 40% of the weight these people were losing was coming from their lean mass. That means potentially for every 10 kilograms a person was losing, 4 kilograms was coming from tissues like their muscle and their bones. That is a lot. And only 6 kilograms was actually coming from their fat. So 40% of the weight loss on these drugs, depending on the people, could be coming from their lean mass, their fat-free mass. That is very, very difficult. We don't want to lose muscle and bone, especially as we get older. Now, it's interesting to see what happens when these people don't want to take the drug anymore. In fact, studies in Europe and in the United States finds that about 70% of people that are on these drugs stop taking them after they've been on it for 2 years. After 2 years, the patient doesn't want to take it anymore. It's not the doctor who makes them stop, it's the patient who stops taking it. They don't like feeling sick in their stomach anymore. They don't like that their muscles and their bones are going away because the doses of the drugs are just so high. So 70% of people stop taking it. And what happens, do you think, to their weight loss when they stop taking it? Well, all the weight they lost starts to come back immediately. Now, in this study that you see here that was just published, you can see, well, Professor Bikman, they went down, then 1 year later, within 1 year, they had gained back. They were within about 5 kilograms. However, if they keep going, the weight keeps going up. And it gets closer and closer and closer until there's no difference between them anymore. But even if they keep some weight off, what do we gain back? Now, what do I mean by that? Remember, 40% of the weight a person loses on these drugs is coming from lean mass, like their muscle or their bone. So they're losing 6 kilograms of fat, they're losing 4 kilograms of lean mass, which comes back very, very quickly, and which doesn't. The problem with this result is that fat comes back very easily, whereas muscle and bone sometimes won't come back at all, depending on how old the person is. And it's harder in women to gain that muscle and bone back than it is in men. And so as an actual percent of their body, the person's still maybe 5 kilograms less, but they're probably actually fatter than they were before they ever started taking the drug. This is important because if you are talking to your friend and your friend is on the drug or they're curious about the drug, you just say, usually people stop taking the drug at 2 years because they just feel sick all the time. And when they do stop taking the drug, they gain all of their weight back. But maybe not the muscle and bone. That may be gone for good. Okay, now your friend may then say, all right, well, you just told me that GLP-1 is good, it will help me control my hunger better. But these drugs, which have too much GLP-1, I don't want to do those. They're expensive, or it will make me lose my muscle and my bone. How can I get the benefits of GLP-1 without having to take these drugs? You have an answer. You can tell them, actually, Unimate imbalance can help your intestines produce more GLP-1. And then I bet they will ask you, how? How can these things be so good? You keep telling me that they're so good. How can it even help with GLP-1? First, fiber from balance will come into the intestines, and it will activate these type of cells that are called L cells. And when L cells are activated, the L cells will produce more GLP-1. So the fiber from balance will specifically activate those cells, increasing the GLP-1 in the person's blood. And it's their own GLP-1, and they're increasing it naturally. So it's a good effect, and it will help control hunger. Also, you're not done. You will say there are two molecules called chlorogenic acid and ferulic acid. When the intestines see chlorogenic acid and ferulic acid, it will increase GLP-1 naturally. And once again, your friend would say, how can I get those molecules? And you have a perfect source in Unimate to give them. Now, one of the best things about Unicity is that they know how to pick very good scientists. But also, they like to support research. And Unicity wanted my lab to look at what would happen in the metabolic health with Unimate. And we published an entire paper. One result that we had from that work was to see that GLP-1, in the experiments with more Unimate, GLP-1 went up by about double. It went up by about 2 times in the blood. So this is a very real effect. If your friend is interested in GLP-1 and interested in the weight loss drugs that increase GLP-1, you can tell them, I have something that you should try first. And that would be the Feel Great system. Because you can say, I heard it from a metabolic scientist all the way from America, and he showed us this evidence, because this is from my own lab. So, that brings us to the end. We have the metabolic problem, where because of what we eat, because of how frequently we eat it, we have too much insulin, and that we have too much glucose. This is creating a metabolic storm. And we see this happening around the whole world. People who are experiencing more diabetes, it's because of these problems. People who are experiencing more depression, in many instances, it's because of these problems. Their infertility, their fatty liver disease, their heart disease, their high blood pressure, all of these have one thing in common. They're consequences of this metabolic storm that we are all living in. Now, as much as the problem seems scary, and you're going to teach this to your friends, the solution is so simple. Even though sometimes it's not very easy, the solution is simple, which is we simply need to flip them around. If we can bring insulin down by bringing glucose down, what is a metabolic storm then becomes really part of the metabolic solution, and metabolic health is improved. And as I said, it's simple, but that does not mean it's easy. You need to be very kind to your friends when you're telling them these ideas, and they're telling you how hard it is to control what they eat, how hard it is to take a break from food. You come back to these 2 simple ideas. We need to balance your glucose a little better. That will help control your cravings. That will help control your hunger. It will help control your insulin. It will help reduce your glycation. At the same time, we need to help you learn how to take a break so you don't feel like you have to eat all the time. We are eating ourselves to death, and learning how to fast is key to improving metabolic health. And they still may say, but it is so hard for me to balance my glucose. It is so hard for me to fast frequently. You have the tools to help your friends and your loved ones to feel great. Thank you so much for letting me be your professor. Thank you.
Woo!
Thank you.